Well, it's great to be with you, everyone, and thank you to Archbishop Prowse and the National Centre for Evangelisation for the invitation to speak with you this evening. I wanted to start by saying that the increased focus on evangelisation in our church is not a late and panicked response to emptying pews, declining affiliation, and decreasing social and political influence in Australia. It's true that as a church, we are at a critical moment. Some of the concerning trends in the participation rates and vitality of our local communities have only been accelerated by the pandemic from which we are slowly emerging. While we know Christianity has been at the root of many aspects of Western culture, we also know many Australians are becoming accustomed to getting by without it. However, our church's commitment to evangelisation in Australia is not motivated by the cause of self-preservation or security. As St. Thomas Aquinas wrote with relevance to our church, if the highest aim of a captain were to preserve his ship, he would keep it in port forever. The mission with which we are entrusted is to open all humanity to the encounter with the risen Christ, who by his Holy Spirit is at the heart and the summit and the instigator of the church's mission. It's that living encounter with Christ that is the spark of lifelong worship, the manifestation of gifts and charisms in our church, our faith's hunger for understanding, the discernment of vocations, the sharing of the gospel with others, and justice that lasts. At heart, the desire to evangelise is the manifestation of Christ's life in us, the indwelling of his Spirit, a Spirit that keeps us faithful to Jesus in the present, but also equally compels us as a church to set sail, to leave port and navigate the waters of the world for the sake of his mission. Today, we live not merely in an age of change, but a change of age, as Pope Francis puts it. Many people who are committed to the mission of Jesus, and even some who are not, are asking how the Catholic Church in Australia can best respond to a world of ideas and culture which are radically different than what we knew just a few short decades ago. I think it's a fair question to which we are compelled to offer a response, a reason for our hope. But before we as Catholic evangelists grasp for new methods, expressions, or initiatives in response, what I think the times demand of us is fundamentally a new heart, one convinced of the primacy and urgency of evangelisation in a society which is at once post-Christian, yet spiritually poor and hungry. As the English writer Julian Barnes noted of so many of us in the West, we don't believe in God, but we still miss him. Like the crying onlookers in France amidst the ashes of Notre Dame Cathedral, many in the increasingly secular West remain resistant to religion, but we are still haunted by our Christian origins. For such a time as this, a new heart is needed in Australia for evangelisation to be fruitful. As Pope Francis has underscored, it's impossible to persevere in a fervent evangelisation unless we are convinced from personal experience that it is not the same thing to have known Jesus as not to have known him. It's not the same thing to walk with him as to walk blindly. It's not the same thing to hear his word as not to know it. And it's not the same thing to contemplate him, to worship him, to find our peace in him as not to. As such, our commitment to evangelisation is self-implicating. It will reflect in a good measure the depth of our faith. Do we believe Jesus is who he says he is? And do we believe his message is true? Those two questions are usually enough to get us going and to keep us going in mission when our energy is low, or at the times when the work of renewal in our communities can seem hard or even overwhelming. as experienced at our recent plenary council in Australia, it can be all too tempting for us as Catholics, our Catholic institutions and agencies, to replace this call to personal faith in Jesus Christ with mere ethical action. This is because it can seem easier to all get along on the basis of good works, or to opt out of big church in favour of boutique gatherings of like-minded Christians. In a culture of outrage and polarisation, we can be found afraid to ruffle the feathers in raising as a central concern a person's faith in the existence of a personal God, the teachings of Christ, in the church and a sacramental hierarchy as a part of that Catholic faith, or the need of personal repentance, conversion, and the question of salvation, which presses upon us all. It could also be suggested that one of the other reasons why evangelisation can be minimised or found embarrassing by some is that many of our own, perhaps including some of our leaders, may not have had an experience of life-changing conversion. It is this encounter and the full surrender of our lives to Christ that makes evangelisation a gift rather than a heavy burden. A new heart for evangelisation entails expecting fruit rather than succumbing to a quiet sense of hopelessness or else a loud cynicism that nothing can change. Christ calls us as disciples to bear fruit, and fruit that will last. In this great mission of evangelisation, we are neither to be Pelagian, as if the fruit of changed lives could be the product of our own efforts, nor to take up a quietism that spiritualises a lack of fruit, as if Christ's call to make disciples never applied to us personally or demanded initiative or any effort on our part. Instead, I think we're called to the faith-filled expectation that people can change, or moreover, that Christ can change people. We see this in Mark's Gospel, most notably in the people of Capernaum who expect fruit, in comparison to those in Nazareth, for whom Jesus is all too human, familiar, and mundane. In Capernaum, we see Christ's healing of the paralytic carried by his 4 friends. Their expectation leads them to break through the barriers to their access to Christ. They anticipate that this Jesus is the mercy of God who can heal and restore and raise up all that is paralysed and seemingly immovable in their lives. But just 4 chapters later in Mark, Jesus is found in his hometown of Nazareth. And it's here that Jesus, we hear, can do no miracles in this place. The scriptures tell us he could do no deed of power there. He was amazed at their unbelief. So, as is the nature of love itself, Christ doesn't impose himself upon a hardened heart or heap his presence upon us, but awaits our invitation. He listens for our longing. He awaits our readiness for the hope of his love. Jesus, throughout the scriptures, beckons us to ask, to knock, and to seek the renewal that only he can bring about, so we might receive, enter, and find him there, waiting for us in the heart of time. So a new heart for evangelisation expects change. It expects that lives can be changed by his grace. Of course, in speaking to you tonight, I'm very conscious that evangelisation is much easier to talk about than to do. You know the practical difficulties in changing the hearts and desires of our own people in our parishes, schools, and agencies for this mission. These challenges can be significant, and our Catholic culture in Australia, as elsewhere around the world, leans heavily towards the status quo. In these contemporary times, which I think are not for us, it can be all too easy for us as a church to turn inwards and make do with sacramentalised attenders and half-catechized atheists, rather than making missionary disciples. The church, in her wisdom, couldn't be any clearer that we today in our generation have to be focused outwards on making disciples, making disciples who then make disciples of others and transform the world by their faith. An explicit focus on the unchurched rather than our own self-preservation can even make some of our own people and our communities feel a little uncomfortable, a little like the older brother in the parable of the prodigal son. And we can understand this because, after all, the older brother has been utterly loyal and committed, and the older brother has served his father's house all this time. However, when he realizes it's not about him, but the one who's been lost, the older brother struggles to rejoice at one who had not earned his welcome, but whom the father nevertheless embraces and lavishes upon with love. We know in the mind of Jesus that the older brother is just as lost, because everything the father has is for the older brother too. But what the father wants from his first son is a largeness of heart to rejoice when the lost are saved, a heart for his younger brother who was dead but is now alive. In the culture of many of our Catholic communities, it's too easy for the people inside the church to become a higher priority than reaching those outside the church. And that's understandable to some extent, as the insiders like us, we pay the bills, we lead the ministries, and we volunteer. However, for fear of making these insiders unhappy, our parishes can be tempted to hold on to programs, customs, or ways of doing things, even if those programs or customs aren't bringing any of our current parishioners, let alone any new people, to greater faith and discipleship. In contrast, if we do as Jesus Christ invites us to do, and we seek out and reach the lost and the unchurched, the life of the older brother, if you like, is also renewed. In other words, there's no trade-off between growing the faith of our people and the call to evangelization. Our faith grows through mission, by being sent. Very much like the first apostles in the upper room, we may be scared, unsure, not fully formed, but in the spirit of Christ, we can find the courage to embark on mission like the apostles of the book of Acts, who changed the world and deepened our own faith by sharing it with others. So it is with our Catholic parishes and communities today. The more outward focused we are, the healthiest insiders we create. When churches are inward looking, they tend to create an ever-growing number of demanding consumers with their preferences and entitlements. But when we become missionary and outward looking, we tend to have a healthier culture where people serve and give rather than demand and take. It can seem obvious to us, but we actually need to talk about a vision of discipleship which people can embrace. You'll all know Sherry Waddell. In one of her books, she notes that if no one ever talks about Christian discipleship, it becomes really difficult for people to begin to walk on that road. Unfortunately, most of us aren't spiritual geniuses. If no one ever talks about a given idea, we are no more likely to think of it spontaneously than we are to suddenly invent a new primary colour. To the extent that we don't talk explicitly with one another about discipleship, we make it very, very difficult for most Catholics to think about discipleship. It's really difficult to believe in and live something that you've never heard anyone talk about. In all our relationships, what we assume and take for granted can be lost. These past 60, 70 years as a church, we've assumed people would keep coming to our churches until they didn't. We can assume our marriages and our vocations are okay until they're not. We can assume people are in a living and active personal relationship with God until our pews are empty and no one new comes into Christian life. A polite reticence about the need to talk about discipleship and to talk about making disciples of Catholics and others beside is not without consequence. The fact is, all of us are going somewhere, whether we know it or not, and we will all arrive at a destination in life. The road that we are currently on will lead to a destination, and we generally don't drift in good directions. There are physical paths that lead to physical destinations. There's dietary paths that lead to predictable dietary outcomes. There are financial paths that lead to financial outcomes. And there are relationship paths that lead to relational outcomes. So all of us are on the way to somewhere. And that applies to our communities of faith and our spiritual lives as well. When asked, many Catholics confess that they don't have a living relationship to Jesus. Not because they're bad people, but far too often because they were never actually given a destination that made the journey worthwhile. They never knew that a personal relationship with Jesus was even possible. So we need to implant a clear vision of discipleship in our people, our structures and our ways of doing things, because biblically speaking, we always reap what we sow. Turning to a few practical implications, in making disciples and forming these disciples for our future as a church here in Australia, it's abundantly clear that we can't rely on the pastoral approach anymore that assumes the sacraments will simply take care of it. In the last couple of years, there's been a new General Directory of Catechesis, and it says this: a process of missionary conversion must be begun that is not limited to maintaining the status quo or guaranteeing the administration of sacraments, but presses forward in the direction of evangelization. So if we don't take up the task of evangelizing those who are far from the church and even those who are near, we risk neglecting our duty to awaken in each person that active and personal faith, that fertile soil in which the grace of the sacraments can take root and bear fruit. In other words, mere administration of the sacraments without attention to supportive processes of evangelization is not enough. As a Canadian Catholic evangelist observed, most Catholics who have fallen away from our church have left the active reception of the sacraments because something non-sacramental was missing. And we need to aim to replace that missing item. In most cases, it's relationship. And I think this brings a very important perspective to our mission as Catholics that we have to keep in mind, that especially for those of us who've been committed to life in the church for decades, who've worked hard at the front line, if you like, with various programs and strategies, courses and events. We're called to remember that while good and helpful, all the programs, courses and events we hold are only proxies or the means for evangelizing relationships by which people come to faith in the midst of the church. And that's because, as it's been often said, it's not that programs make disciples, it's disciples that make disciples. To make the point, today we have so many great resources in hand available to us today, more than any other generation of Christian believers. Consider St. Paul, who went out in mission and he didn't even have the 4 Gospels in hand as he embarked on mission across the Mediterranean. However, St. Paul had people. He had disciples making disciples. He had Barnabas, John Mark, Silas, Timothy, Aristarchus, Gaius, and Luke. So even today, we might need programs and materials as a kind of crutch or support, but we have to be mindful of not allowing those supports to replace the relationships. You'll know from your own experience of parish that a good program with unevangelized leaders is not going to convert anyone. So what are some of the steps we can take? Well, one of the first things we can do, and this is shown to be the experience of growing Catholic parishes, is we have to be really clear with our parishioners as well as those who are not part of our community as yet. We have to make really clear to them what they can do in our communities to grow in relationship to Jesus and to show them the journey in our community that will help them to grow in that relationship. So, for example, just thinking of your own community, what's the on-ramp or the shallow end of the pool in your community through which people in your community, in your suburb, might start the journey in discipleship to Christ? Just imagine a ladder with all the lower rungs removed. That wouldn't be very helpful for climbing. And sometimes our church world can seem like that. We, the church people, are on the top of the ladder, but with the lower rungs removed, the unchurched are left with no chance of climbing up. So sometimes we as church people, if you like, can make it difficult for the unchurched to come to church, even when they want to. So how can we define in our parish the rungs on the ladder, whether it's Alpha, whether it's a small group of prayer? How do we give people a very clear vision of the first step or the next step that we can offer them in our community to grow in a personal relationship with Jesus Christ? If you create such a pathway, almost stepping stones in your community, it means that you can actually then start to recognize where people are in that journey of faith, and you can start to deliberately move people from one step to the next step in their faith in the context of a community. And it avoids treating everyone as if they're at the same stage of faith. Some are still looking to be evangelized, while some others are ready for catechesis, while some others are ready to receive the Eucharist because they've encountered Christ and they've given their lives to him. So we know that churches and ministries that have an explicit pathway for growing disciples have a higher rate of conversion than those communities that don't, than those who, if you like, are more haphazard and simply offer group upon group and program upon program. So in this short time together, I hope you've been encouraged and challenged in the mission of the church in Australia, which is as urgent as ever and still possible as ever. In the midst of the conversation that the church in Australia is having about its future, it is people such as yourselves at the front line of our church that shape the future by our leadership and your witness under the good graces of God. When each of our communities start to cast a vision of discipleship, of what it means to live the full Christian life, when we start proclaiming the name of Jesus explicitly and sharing his charisma and his meaning for our world today, when we start developing the discipleship of our own people, our programs and our resources will become effective and attractive. And when we explicitly articulate a steady path of spiritual growth in our communities, we'll see the beginnings of the renewal that Jesus promises us in every age. Thank you very much.